The summer heat was finally starting to cool down. When David finished his evening routine at the desert observatory, being alone in the middle of nowhere wasn't new to him anymore. He'd been working at this remote research station in Nevada for almost 8 months now, scanning the night sky for any signs of life beyond Earth. Most nights were pretty much the same. He'd set up his equipment, monitor radio signals from space, and hope for something interesting to show up on his screens. His job was to look for patterns that might indicate intelligent life, somewhere out there among the stars. So far, he'd found nothing but cosmic background noise and the occasional satellite interference. That Tuesday night started like any other. David had just finished calibrating his main antenna when something weird happened. His computer screen started showing readings he'd never seen before. The energy signature was completely different from anything in his database. It wasn't coming from any known satellite or space junk floating around Earth. At first, he thought his equipment was acting up again. The desert heat could mess with electronics pretty badly, but when he ran diagnostics, everything checked out. Fine, the signal was real, and it was getting stronger by the minute. David grabbed his coffee mug and settled in for what he thought would be a long night of data analysis. He loved these moments when something unusual popped up, even though it almost always turned out to be some boring technical glitch or interference from a passing airplane. But this time was different. The readings kept climbing, and the pattern didn't match anything he'd ever studied. After about 20 minutes of staring at his screens, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, something made him look up toward the observatory door. Standing there, silhouetted against the starlit sky, was a woman. David's heart nearly jumped out of his chest. He wasn't expecting anyone, especially not at this hour. The nearest town was 40 miles away, and visitors had to check in at the main gate during daytime hours. She stepped into the soft glow of his equipment lights, and David got his first good look at her. She was tall, maybe around 6 feet, with dark hair that seemed to catch and reflect the starlight in an unusual way. Her skin had this strange luminous quality, like she was lit from within by some gentle light source. What really caught his attention were her eyes. They were dark, but they seemed to hold depths that reminded him of looking into deep space through his telescope. There was something ancient and knowing in her gaze, like she'd seen things that would take lifetimes to understand. "I hope I'm not interrupting your work," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent he couldn't quite place. It sounded vaguely European, but there was something else mixed in that he'd never heard before. David stood up slowly, still trying to process what was happening. His first thought was that maybe she was lost, but then he wondered how anyone could have gotten past the security checkpoint without him being notified. "No, it's okay," he managed to say, though his voice cracked a little. "I wasn't expecting anyone, though. Are you lost? Do you need help getting back to town?" She smiled, and something about that smile made David feel both comfortable and slightly unsettled at the same time. It was warm and genuine, but there was something behind it that suggested she knew things he didn't. "I'm not lost," she said, taking a few steps closer to his equipment setup. "Actually, I was hoping to talk to someone who understands the stars. I noticed your antenna array from quite a distance away." That's when David realized his equipment was still going crazy. The energy readings were off the charts now, and the pattern was unlike anything he'd ever recorded. He looked back at the woman, then at his screens, then back at her again. "This is going to sound really strange," he said, gesturing toward his computer monitors. "But my equipment started picking up some kind of unusual energy signature right before you showed up. Have you seen any aircraft or anything weird in the area tonight?" Instead of looking confused like most people would, she walked over to his main display screen and studied the readings with obvious understanding. She nodded slowly, like she was confirming something she already knew. "Your instruments are quite sophisticated," she said, running her finger along the edge of his keyboard. Without actually touching it, they're detecting quantum field fluctuations that most Earth-based technology wouldn't even register. David felt his mouth drop open. "Earth-based technology? What do you mean by that?" She turned to face him directly, And in that moment, David felt like his whole understanding of reality was about to shift. There was something in her expression that told him his quiet night of routine observations was over, and whatever came next was going to change everything. "My name is Zara," she said simply, "and I think we have a lot to talk about." The way she said it, so calm and matter of fact, made David's scientific mind start racing with possibilities he'd only ever dreamed about. His hands were actually shaking as he reached for his chair, needing something stable to hold onto. This was either the most elaborate prank someone had ever pulled on him, or his life's work was about to become very interesting in ways he never imagined possible. Their 20th night together was different from the start. David could sense something had changed in Zara's mood. She seemed more thoughtful than usual, spending long moments staring up at the stars before speaking. The easy conversation they'd developed over the past few weeks felt heavier somehow. They were sitting outside the observatory on the folding chairs David had set up for their nightly talks. The desert sky was putting on quite a show that evening, with meteor showers streaking across the darkness every few minutes. Zara would identify each one, telling David which star system they originated from and how long they'd been traveling through space. "That one came from the direction of my home system," she said, pointing to a particularly bright streak, "though it's been traveling for thousands of years. So it left long before I was born." David watched her face as she tracked the meteors across the sky. There was something sad in her expression that he'd been noticing more often lately. She'd been talking about her mission more frequently, mentioning deadlines and reports she needed to complete. "Do you ever miss it?" David asked. "Your home, I mean." Zara was quiet for a long time before answering. "I miss the certainty of it," she finally said. "Knowing exactly what my role was, what was expected of me, how each day would unfold. Life there is very structured, very planned out. Everyone has their purpose from a young age." "That sounds kind of lonely too, in its own way," David said. "It is," Zara agreed. "But it's a different kind of loneliness. There, I was alone because that was my assigned role. Here, I'm learning what it feels like to be lonely because of choice, because of wanting something I can't have." David felt his chest tighten at her words. Over the past 3 weeks, he'd been trying not to think too hard about what he was feeling for Zara. It wasn't possible enough already without adding complicated emotions to the mix. The conversation drifted to other topics, but David could feel an undercurrent of sadness running through everything they discussed. Zara talked about her people's customs around relationships and partnerships, explaining how they form deep bonds, but rarely with beings from other worlds. "We believe that love, or something like it, exists throughout the universe," she said, her voice soft in the desert night. "But we also believe that some connections are too difficult to maintain across the distances between worlds. The practical challenges usually outweigh the emotional benefits." "That seems pretty cold," David said, surprised by the slight edge in his own voice. "It's not cold, it's realistic," Zara replied, but she didn't sound entirely convinced by her own words. "When you live as long as we do, you learn to think in terms of centuries, not months or years. Temporary connections can become very painful over such long periods." David stared up at the stars, feeling frustrated by the impossibility of their situation. Here he was, having the most meaningful conversations of his life with someone who would eventually leave and never come back. Every night with Zara made him happier than he'd been in years, but also more aware of how empty his life would feel when she was gone. "Your people sound like they have everything figured out," he said, and he couldn't keep the bitterness out of his voice entirely. Zara turned to look at him directly. "Do I seem like I have everything figured out, David?" Something in her tone made his frustration melt away instantly. When he looked at her, he saw the same uncertainty and confusion he'd been feeling. She wasn't some detached alien observer studying him like a lab specimen. She was someone dealing with feelings that were just as complicated and confusing as his own. "No," he said softly, "you seem like someone who's trying to figure things out just like the rest of us." That's when it happened. They were looking at each other in the dim light from the observatory equipment, and David felt overwhelmed by how much he'd come to care about her. The whole situation was impossible. She was from another world, literally from the stars he'd spent his career studying. She would leave eventually, probably soon, and he'd never see her again. But sitting there in the desert night, none of that seemed to matter as much as the connection he felt with her. In a moment of vulnerability mixed with the kind of nervous humor he used. When he didn't know what else to do, David heard himself saying, "Well, marry me then." He laughed as soon as the words left his mouth, expecting Zara to laugh too. It was such an absurd thing to say. A human scientist asking an alien survey specialist to marry him after knowing her for 3 weeks. If he'd read that in a science fiction story, he would have rolled his eyes at how ridiculous it sounded. But Zara didn't laugh. Instead, her whole expression changed. The guarded, slightly distant look she sometimes got when discussing her people or her mission completely disappeared. For a moment, she looked entirely present, entirely focused on him with an intensity that made David's breath catch. Then she smiled, but it wasn't the polite, friendly smile he'd grown used to. This smile was different, sad and beautiful and full of longing. It was the kind of smile that carried weight, like it was holding back years of unspoken feelings. "I wish," she said, and her voice was so quiet David almost didn't hear her. Those 2 words hit David like a physical impact. All the joking atmosphere evaporated instantly, replaced by something heavy and real and frightening in her voice. He heard centuries of loneliness, the burden of duty and rules and expectations that kept her isolated from the very connections she craved. David froze, his coffee mug halfway to his lips, as the full meaning of what had just happened settled over him. This wasn't funny anymore. This wasn't a casual friendship between a curious human and a visiting alien. This was to people who had found something rare and precious together, and who were both trapped by circumstances that made it impossible to pursue. The desert around them seemed to hold its breath. Even the usual night sounds of insects and distant winds seemed to fade away, leaving them sitting in a bubble of silence that felt charged with electricity. David realized that his joke had accidentally revealed the truth they'd both been avoiding. They had fallen for each other across the impossible distance between worlds, and neither of them had any idea what to do about it. The month that followed that night changed everything between David and Zara. The awkwardness David had expected after his accidental proposal never came. Instead, something deeper and more honest settled between them. They both knew now that their feelings were real, even if they couldn't do anything about them. Zara started sharing parts of herself she'd kept hidden before. She told David about her childhood on a world where 3 suns painted the sky in colors Earth had no names for. She described cities that floated among the clouds and gardens where plants sang in harmony with the wind. But she also talked about the pressure of being chosen for important missions, the weight of representing her people, and the loneliness of always being the observer, never the participant. "I was selected for this role because I'm good at staying detached," she said one night as they walked around the observatory grounds. "My supervisors thought I wouldn't get emotionally involved with the worlds I studied. They were wrong." David had started documenting everything. At first, he told himself, it was for scientific purposes. If this was humanity's first real contact with alien life, someone should be keeping records. But as the days passed, he realized he was really creating a diary of the most important relationship of his life, even if it was one that couldn't. Last out, he wrote down the way Zara's eyes seemed to catch starlight, how she hummed melodies from her home world when she thought he wasn't listening, and the sadness that crept into her voice whenever she talked about her mission deadlines. "David," she said during their 4th week together, "I need to tell you something important. My people have been receiving my reports, and they're not happy with what they're seeing." David felt his stomach drop. "What do you mean? They can tell that my objectivity has been compromised," Zara explained, settling into the chair that had basically become hers. "When we send reports back home, they contain more than just words. They carry emotional impressions, traces of what we're feeling when we write them. My recent reports have been different." "Different how?" Zara was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the desert landscape. They can sense attachment. They know I've formed a connection here that goes beyond professional interest. In their words, I've become emotionally invested in a subject of study. The way she said subject of study made David wince. Is that what I am to you? You know you're not, Zara said quickly, turning to face him. That's exactly the problem. You're not supposed to be anything more than that, but you've become everything. David felt his heart racing at her words, even as the reality of their situation became clearer. What happens now? My mission is being cut short, Zara said, and David could hear the pain in her voice. They want me to complete my final assessments and return home within the next 2 weeks. They're concerned that staying longer will compromise not just this mission, but my ability to handle future assignments. 2 weeks. David stared up at the stars that had brought Zara to him and would soon take her away again. It felt impossible that something so important could have such a definite ending date. Is there any way to extend it? He asked, though he already knew the answer. I've tried, Zara said softly. I told them I needed more time to complete a thorough analysis of Earth's technological development, but they can read between the lines. They know what's really happening. The next few nights took on a desperate quality. David and Zara talked about everything and nothing, both trying to cram a lifetime of conversation into the time they had left. Zara shared more stories about her world, her family, the advanced technology that made travel between stars as routine as David's drive to the nearest town. She showed him images on a device that projected three-dimensional pictures into the air. Her home was beautiful beyond anything David had ever imagined, with architecture that seemed to grow from the landscape rather than being built on top of it. Her people were tall and graceful like her, with the same luminous quality to their skin that made them look like they were lit from within. What would happen if you just didn't go back? David asked one night, though he felt guilty even suggesting it. I would be cut off completely, Zara said. No way to communicate with my family, no access to our technology or medical care. And eventually, being away from our energy sources would affect my health. I might live for decades, but not centuries like I would at home. And if I somehow went with you, Zara looked at him with an expression full of love and sadness. The biological changes required would be extreme. You would need to adapt to different atmospheric conditions, different energy sources, different everything, and there would be no guarantee that my people would accept you. Humans aren't considered advanced enough for full integration into our society. David felt frustration building in his chest. So we're stuck. You have to choose between your entire life and staying here with me. And I have to choose between everything I've ever known and taking a chance on a world that might not even want me. That's exactly what we're facing, Zara said quietly. They spent their remaining time talking about impossible solutions. Maybe David could find a way to develop technology that would let them communicate across the stars. Maybe Zara could convince her people to set up a permanent research station on Earth. Maybe there were other options they hadn't thought of yet. But deep down, they both knew they were just postponing the inevitable. The mathematics of their situation were cruel and simple. Love might be universal, but so were the practical realities that made some connections impossible to maintain. On what they both knew would be one of their last nights together, David asked the question that had been haunting him. Do you regret meeting me? Zara was quiet for so long that David started to worry he'd asked the wrong thing. Then she reached over and took his hand, something she'd never done before. Her skin was warm, but felt different from human skin, smoother and somehow more alive. No, she said finally, even knowing how much it hurts to leave. I don't regret a single moment. You've shown me what it feels like to connect with someone completely, to be understood not just as a representative of my people, but as myself. That's not something I'll ever forget. No matter where I go next. David squeezed her hand, memorizing the feel of it. Tomorrow night, or the night after, she would be gone, and he would be alone again under the same stars that had once seemed full of possibility, and now seemed empty and distant. David knew something was different the moment Zara arrived that final evening. She appeared earlier than usual, just as the sun was setting rather than after full darkness had settled over the desert. In her hands, She carried a small device that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. "This is my last night here," she said without any greeting. And David felt his world tilt sideways even though he'd been expecting this moment. They sat in their usual spot outside the observatory, but neither of them seemed to know how to begin the conversation. How do you say goodbye to someone who has become the center of your universe in just a few weeks? How do you let go of something you never really had the chance to fully hold onto? "I have something to tell you," Zara said finally, her voice carrying a mix of determination and fear. "Something I learned yesterday when I was preparing my final reports." David waited, though part of him was afraid to hear whatever she was about to reveal. "My people's technology is more advanced than I've let you understand," she began, turning the small device over in her hands. "We don't just travel between worlds. We can manipulate the fundamental structure of matter, including biological matter. It's how we've been able to explore so many different types of planets over the centuries." "What does that mean exactly?" David asked, though he had a feeling he wasn't going to like the answer. "It means that if someone truly wanted to relocate from one world to another permanently, it would be possible. The process would completely restructure their biology to match their new environment. They would essentially become a native of whatever world they chose." David's heart started racing. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying that you could come with me," Zara said quietly. "The technology exists to transform you into something that could survive on my world. You would be able to breathe our atmosphere, process our food, withstand our energy sources. To outside observers, you would appear to be one of my people." David stared at her, his mind reeling with possibilities he hadn't dared to imagine. "What would that be like? Would I still be me? Your memories, your personality? Your core self would remain unchanged," Zara explained. "But your body would be completely different. Your lifespan would extend to match ours. Your physical capabilities would be enhanced. In many ways, you would become more than human." But David could hear the hesitation in her voice. "But the process is completely irreversible. Once the transformation is complete, there would be no way to return to being human. You would never be able to come back to Earth or survive in Earth's environment again. Everything you've ever known, everyone you've ever cared about, would be lost to you forever." David felt dizzy as the full weight of what she was offering hit him. "And what about you? Could you stay here instead?" "That's the other option," Zara said, her voice growing even quieter. "I could undergo a similar process to become fully human. I would lose most of my extended abilities, my connection to our technology, and my natural lifespan would be reduced to match yours. I would also be permanently cut off from my people and my world." They sat in silence for several minutes, both trying to process the magnitude of these choices. David looked up at the stars, thinking about all the nights he'd spent scanning them sky for signs of life out there, never imagining that the answer would come to him in the form of love. "How long do we have to decide?" he asked. "The transformation process would need to begin tonight. Before I'm scheduled to leave," Zara said. "My people expect me to depart at dawn. After that, the opportunity would be lost." David's scientific mind started racing through the implications. Leave Earth forever, abandon his career, his life, everything he'd ever known. To travel to a world he'd only seen in projected images. Or ask Zara to give up her advanced civilization, her family, her people, to stay on a world that would be primitive compared to what she was used to. "What do you want to do?" he asked her. "I want to be with you," Zara said simply, "but I don't know how to choose between two impossible options. If you come with me, you'll be giving up your entire species, your home planet, everything that made you who you are. If I stay here, I'll be doing the same thing." David stood up and walked to the edge of the observatory platform, looking out at the vast desert that stretched toward the horizon. In a few hours, the sun would rise on a world that either contained both of them or neither of them together. "There's something else you need to know," Zara said behind him. "Even if one of us chooses transformation, there's no guarantee of acceptance. Your people might reject me as an outsider, even in human form. My people definitely won't welcome you easily, regardless of how perfectly the biological changes work." David turned back to face her, So we could sacrifice everything and still end up alone anyway. It's possible, Zara admitted. They talked through the night as the hours slipped away toward dawn. They discussed every angle, every possibility, every consequence they could think of. David imagined what it would be like to walk among beings who had mastered technologies that Earth was centuries away from developing. Zara pictured herself aging at a human rate, watching David grow old and die while she slowly forgot what it felt like to touch the stars. As the eastern sky began to show the first hints of light, David realized that Zara had been quiet for a long time. She was holding the transformation device, but she hadn't activated it. "You've already decided, haven't you?" he said. Zara looked up at him with tears in her eyes, something he'd never seen before. "I've decided that I love you too much to ask you to give up your entire world for me, and I love you too much to abandon my people and everything I've ever known, only to potentially burden you with the responsibility of making me happy in a life I might struggle to adapt to." David felt his heart breaking and mending at the same time. "So you're choosing neither option?" "I'm choosing to remember that sometimes love means letting go," Zara said, standing up as the sky continued to lighten. "I'm choosing to believe that what we've shared these past weeks was real and meaningful, even if it can't continue." Before David could respond, she pressed the small device into his hands. It was warm and seemed to pulse with energy. "This is a communication device," she explained. "It can send one message across the stars, should you ever truly need me. Not for loneliness or sadness, but for genuine emergency or need. It will only work once, so use it carefully." David looked down at the device, then back up at Zara. The growing dawn light was making her luminous skin seem to fade, as if she was already becoming less solid, less present in any universe, in any form. She said, echoing his joke from weeks ago, "I would have said yes." Then she smiled that same heartbreaking smile she'd given him the night he'd accidentally proposed. And David watched as she simply faded away into the morning light, leaving him alone with the device and memories of the most important weeks of his life. 6 months later, David published research papers that revolutionized several fields of physics. He never mentioned that his insights came from conversations with someone from the stars, but every breakthrough brought him closer to understanding the science behind the love that had changed everything. The next 3 weeks completely changed David's life in ways he never could have imagined. That first night with Zara had lasted until sunrise, filled with conversations that challenged everything he thought he knew about physics and the universe. She had shown him things that shouldn't have been possible. With just a wave of her hand, she could manipulate his computer displays, showing him star charts of systems that weren't in any Earth database. She knew about quantum mechanics at a level that made his PhD feel like elementary school knowledge. But what really convinced David that she was telling the truth about being from another world was her complete understanding of problems that Earth's greatest scientists were still trying to solve. She casually mentioned solutions to energy equations that had stumped researchers for decades, talking about them like they were basic math. Every evening after sunset, she would appear near the observatory. David never saw her arrive or leave. She was just suddenly there, standing in the doorway with that same gentle smile, ready to continue their conversations from the night before. During their second meeting, Zara explained more about why she was on Earth. She told David that she was part of what she called a survey mission. Her people were facing serious environmental challenges on their home planet, and they were quietly studying other worlds to see if any might be suitable for future contact or possible relocation. "We've been watching Earth for quite some time," she said, settling into the chair David had brought out for her. "Your species is at an interesting point in its development. You're starting to reach beyond your own planet, but you're also dealing with many of the same problems we faced centuries ago." David learned that Zara's people lived much longer than humans. What she considered to be young age was actually several hundred Earth years. The way she talked about time was different too. She would mention events from decades ago like they happened last week, but also speak about the future in terms of thousands of years. "Time moves differently when you live as long as we do," She explained one night as they watched satellites pass overhead. What seems urgent to you might seem like a small moment to us, but that doesn't make your time less valuable. In some ways, your shorter lives make everything more precious. As the days passed, David found himself looking forward to sunset more than he ever had before. His daytime work became just something to get through until Zara arrived. He started preparing questions during the day, writing down things he wanted to discuss with her about space travel, other civilizations, and what life was like among the stars. But their conversations weren't all about science and space. David discovered that despite coming from an advanced civilization, Zara understood loneliness in a way that surprised him. She talked about the isolation of traveling between worlds, of being responsible for important decisions that affected entire populations, and of rarely having someone to share her real thoughts with. Being the one sent to study other worlds sounds exciting, she told him during their 10th meeting. But it's also very solitary. I spend most of my time observing and reporting, never really connecting with the places or people I encounter. David understood that feeling completely. His work at the observatory was exactly what he'd always wanted to do, but the isolation had been getting to him more than he liked to admit. Before Zara started visiting, he'd been going weeks without having a real conversation with anyone. I used to think finding life beyond Earth would be the greatest discovery possible, David said one night as they shared coffee he'd learned to make extra strong for their long conversations. But I never thought about what it would be like to actually meet someone from out there. I always imagined it would be all about exchanging scientific information. Zara laughed. And David loved that sound. It was musical in a way that reminded him of wind chimes, but completely natural and warm. The universe is full of life, she said. Some of it is very different from what you have here on Earth, but the basic needs are often the same. Everyone wants to feel understood, to have purpose, to connect with others who appreciate who they are. By the 3rd week, David realized that his feelings about Zara had grown beyond scientific curiosity or even friendship. He looked forward to her visits with an intensity that sometimes worried him. When she was there, talking about distant worlds and sharing perspectives he'd never considered, he felt more alive and engaged than he had in years. But he also started to worry about how long this could last. Zara had mentioned that her mission wouldn't go on indefinitely, and David had no idea what would happen when it ended. The thought of going back to his solitary nights, scanning empty space for signals that never came, felt unbearable now. How long do these survey missions usually take? He asked her one night, trying to sound casual about it. Zara's expression grew more serious than usual. It depends on what we find, she said quietly. Sometimes a few months, sometimes longer. But, David, you should know that getting attached to places or people we study isn't supposed to happen. It can compromise the objectivity of our reports. The way she said it made David's heart sink. He was starting to understand that whatever was growing between them wasn't just complicated. Because she was from another world, it was also against the rules of her people, which meant their time together might be more limited than he'd hoped.